Welcome back to Upon Further Review, your bi-monthly snapshot of sports in the age of COVID. Joining Matt and myself now is a reporter for The Age in Australia, in Melbourne, I believe, to talk about the ever-changing, chaotic situation that's going on in Melbourne leading up to the Australian Open. Anthony Colangelo. Anthony, thanks for joining us.
No worries, guys. How you going?
Doing all right, sir. Doing probably better than Serrano Tristea right now, or Alze Cornet, as it seems. So kind of give us a snapshot of what the lay of the land is now. What was the initial plan for the players coming into Australia in terms of the quarantine and being able to train? And what is the situation now?
All right. Well, the initial plan was that players would come in and do 2 weeks of quarantine in their hotels, but be allowed 5 hours outside of their hotel rooms. That 5 hours, they'd be taken to practice courts, and they'd also be allowed to do some nutrition and I think some recovery, some physio and things like that. So players agreed, decided to come down. Now, where there's a point of contention at the moment is the question, rather, would players go from having those 5 hours outside to having to do 14 days hard hotel quarantine, lockdown, can't leave your hotel room for any reason, if there was a positive test to any passenger on their charter flights to Australia? There have been a few players who've said that they did not know this. Another one, a New Zealander, said we did know this. It was clearly stated to players. The Victorian government, which is the state that we're in, and Tennis Australia, excuse me, say players were notified. So yeah, there's a little bit of tit for tat in that sense. I do believe that they were notified. And I just think, some players may have been confused, may not have known. At the end of the day, it's only been 4 or 5 players that have come out and complained about it. The vast majority are not complaining. They're going ahead with it and doing what they need to do. So I think, in any situation, you're going to hear, and the news media especially likes to amplify the voices that are complaining a lot more. And I think that's what's happening here. However, the situation as it stands now, the players are meant to go out for their first training session this morning, but there were delays and they were told that some sessions were cancelled. We're not sure why, so we're waiting on confirmation of that. So look, it's not running completely smoothly, but I think for every player that is complaining, the vast majority are not. I've been looking at a lot of their Instagrams and they're just getting on with it. They're doing exercise in their hotel rooms. They're hitting balls against windows, against mattresses. They're making do.
Anthony, Matt Zemek here. One interesting complication and plot twist here is the situations of players who flew into Adelaide versus those who flew into Melbourne. How much is that particular detail confusing the situation, given that the players in the different cities might be affected to a different degree?
Yeah, I think it is confusing the situation, not least because the health authorities in Adelaide and Tennis Australia won't be clear about what the differences are between those in quarantine in Adelaide and those in quarantine in Melbourne. Obviously, the ones in quarantine in Melbourne are the big names. It's Djokovic, Nadal, Williams, Dominic Thiem, and a few others. But so obviously you'd expect that the big players would probably have better facilities, maybe bigger rooms. I think they've had more people allowed to travel with them, so bigger travelling parties. Whether they're allowed out to train with more people is a question we're asking and wanting to get clarity on. That clarity lacking is not helping. But, of course, some players in Melbourne in their smaller hotel rooms are going to be annoyed. But again, we're looking for more clarity on that. I don't know if you guys know anything about that. That might help me. But I don't know. Tennis is a funny one because there's differences anywhere, right? Like, Novak Djokovic has always got better facilities, more people traveling with him, gets to pick the best courts for practice and to play on because, he's the number 1 player in the world.
Now, Anthony, to clarify, because we want this. This is the purpose of our show, is to kind of get bird's eye and to bring local journalists and to show regard for local journalists as opposed to what we hear from the larger talking heads who just sort of opine, get the on the ground scoop. So to clarify, they still can practice for 5 hours in Melbourne, because I was told that there was a 14-day lockdown and they can't leave their rooms. They can't even pop their heads out unless there's some sort of emergency.
No, to be clear, so there's 72 players who are in hard lockdown and cannot leave their room. They're the ones who are on three. There are 3 flights now that have had a positive test. The rest of them are able to leave their hotel room still. That's the vast majority of them, by the way. But there are 72 who are kind of doing it quite tough in 14 days stuck in the hotel room. I spoke to one this morning, Artem Sitak from New Zealand, and he's going to train 3 hours a day from 3 p.m. till 6 p.m. He's got a book to read. He's doing some study. It's going to be difficult, but it's they were aware that it was a possibility.
Anthony, one question that's obviously of interest for tennis fans in particular is the way that the governing bodies in tennis, such as they are, have a role in all of this. And of course, tennis has such dysfunctional, decentralized governance of the sport. What to the best of your understanding has been the relationship between the 2 tours, Tennis Australia, and the local governments in Australia in terms of all trying to get on the same page and create consistent standards so that all players are treated equally? And just before you answer, Anthony, just for a little more background, there were lots of controversies at both the French Open and the US Open last year in terms of how certain players were treated in terms of quarantine, isolation situations. So what's been the dialogue, to the best of your knowledge, involving the tours, Tennis Australia, and local governments on the ground in Australia?
Yeah, so those bodies that you mentioned have been in discussions for months about this. And I think the dialogue's been quite good. The one sticking point was going to be, like, the Australian Open wouldn't have gone ahead if the Victorian government and the Victorian health authorities didn't agree to allow players that 5-hour window to train outside of their hotel room. Like, if that wasn't agreed upon, the Australian Open wouldn't have happened. It was agreed upon, and it is happening. So in that respect, the fact that they were able to get to a point where this is going ahead, I think shows that, the dialogue's been quite good and everyone's kind of made compromises. Where it's difficult is the Victorian public. We went through a 3-month lockdown in the middle of the year, in our winter. It seems ridiculous to say. We had 700 cases a day, which isn't anywhere near what you guys are experiencing in the US. But we sought to completely lock down and get ourselves back to zero. We've done that after 3 months inside. So the public is now seeing these tennis players being parachuted in to Melbourne who are kind of complaining about having to do 2 weeks quarantine. And also a lot of Australians overseas and interstate are having trouble getting into Victoria. So it's playing out against that kind of backdrop, and tennis players aren't getting, and the government, tennis players and Tennis Australia are getting no sympathy from the public here. That at the moment is where is what's most difficult, because you've got all these bodies, government, Tennis Australia, ATP, WTA, trying. What are they trying to do? They're trying to make it seem as if they're grateful enough and they're essentially deserving of running this tournament and of being here, when the public, which traditionally loves this event in Australia, we're so lucky to have it every year. It's just a brilliant event. It's fantastic to cover as a journalist. It's fantastic to cover as a fan. But this year it's quite different because we've been through the pandemic and there's some double standards at play. But having said that, all those bodies came together and have been able to come to this agreement to essentially agree to get the players to agree to travel here.
Hearing, piggybacking on what Matt was asking in your answer, Anthony, in terms of they've gotten on the same page in terms of what they know, how the protocols are going to transpire and be carried out. But in terms of communication to the players, that's also where the devil is in the details, where the rubber meets the road, is sometimes the communication isn't very good coordinated. So did Tennis Australia take the lead, or did the different tours or the different governing bodies kind of multiply onto each other and piggyback on each other, or was there one voice sending out to the different teams? Because it's not just players; it's their coaches, it's their publicists, other folks as well.
Yeah. So you're talking about communication to the players, coaches,
right? A meeting of the mind, right? Because with any contract, it's all about a meeting of the minds.
Yep. So Tennis Australia took we're on the front foot in that regard. They were the ones communicating to the players, the coaches, the entourages, the staff of the players about what the rules are going to be. And as I said, from speaking to Artem, the New Zealand doubles player, he said it was made crystal clear what the expectations were. Yesterday, there were a few players who said it wasn't clear, but I think evidenced by what this player has said to me, and also by the fact that most players aren't complaining, it was made clear. Tennis Australia said they made it clear. They said they told the players, the end of the day, the decision on your quarantine is down to the Victorian health authorities. And if you get here and they deem that your flight has been too great a risk, then they'll lock everybody on that flight down. So just know that is a risk that can happen. The communication was clear in that respect, I believe.
Matt, can I ask a quick follow-up on that?
Sure.
Yeah.
Because the question I would have, and I saw your video with, I think it was Artem Sitak from New Zealand. Obviously, and this goes into how the various countries have dealt with what is an epochal, I call it the first large-scale reckoning of how we arrange our lives as a species, is what COVID-19 has become. And with New Zealand and with Australia, to varying degrees, they had hard lockdowns. They're island countries. So if they're able to get a hard lockdown at the very beginning, they're able to control it very easily. But if something gets in very quickly, it can get out of control very fast. So they took it a lot more seriously than, say, we did in the States. So would say a guy like from New Zealand, would his expectations be framed through his experience of having gone through hard lockdowns, which someone from, say, a Tennis Sandgren or Alze Cornet maybe necessarily hasn't gone through to the same degree, and therefore they have an expectation of, hey, this is how it's going to go anyway.
Yeah, that's true. But, having said that, I've still seen plenty of players on social media say they're just going to put their heads down and get through it. Even Tennis Sandgren's not complaining. I've seen him on social media. I think this morning was talking about how he got an exercise bike and he's been riding on his exercise bike. So, plenty of European players as well. A few of the Italian players were complaining about the food early on, which I get, being from an Italian background. I don't think that's abnormal at all. Italians are going to complain about food all the time. But yeah, I get your point, and there's probably some of them. Svetlana Kuznetsova. Looking at her Instagram, she's in lockdown at the moment, and she was kind of just taking people through how all her food and laundry was left at the door, and she opened her door, picked up the food, and there's somebody kind of there watching to make sure she doesn't take one step outside of that door.
It's like China.
Yeah, it is. And, she wasn't complaining. She might, it might be tough, but she's gonna do it. And I think most of them are happy to.
Anthony, what were the discussions, not about the Australian Open, but about the ATP Cup going through? I mean, just the reality that you're having a different event, a lead-up event, even in the midst of the pandemic. How much of a logistical hurdle was that? Maybe it wasn't that dramatic since it's kind of bundled in with the Australian Open, but maybe it was. How would you characterize any of the discussions and concerns surrounding the ATP Cup as the lead-in to the Australian Open in this particular pandemic situation?
Yeah, there were some discussions and it might not go ahead, and they just have smaller ATP events in the lead-up instead, or more of those smaller ATP events in the lead-up instead. But at the end of the day, we're lucky at Melbourne. We have a big facility and we can house all those events here anyway. So I think it was made easy. And again, one of the other things the players wanted was they wanted, lead-up practice events before the Australian Open. So again, moving it back a week or so allowed that to happen. So I don't think it was a massive hurdle, because once they've done the 2 weeks quarantine, I mean, that's another thing. Once they're on the 2 weeks quarantine, they can live a normal life, which is essentially what we're doing here now. Once they're out of that 2 weeks, they can do whatever they want. I mean, we have some very light rules in terms of social distancing and masks, but everything is open. Restaurants, gyms. There's going to be crowds at the ATP Cup and the Australian Open. So I don't think it was too much of a sticking point. The biggest sticking point really was whether they would be allowed to practice in quarantine, which they got.
Anthony, I had a question specifically about the flights. There were, from what I understand, there were how many charters? There were 3 or 4 charters. There were.
There was a lot. There was. I think there was 15 or 16. 3 of them have had positive tests.
Okay, now the question I have is because one particular positive test on one of the flights was of a non-playing passenger. Was that non-playing passenger with a player's entourage, or was that non-playing passenger just a separate person coming to Australia? Because the question I would have is, how come it was okay? Because the question I would have is, why not have a separate set of flights just for players? So at the very least, they would, even if somebody's coaches contract something, that would not compromise any players.
Yeah, no, they were all charter flights. So there was no members of the public on there other than the flight attendant. And that person that tested positive was a flight attendant.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which, maybe they just shouldn't have had flight attendants on the plane, but I guess somebody needs to be there to help them if the thing goes down. But, yeah.
There's also a complication here that now Novak Djokovic, ironically, one of the players in the privileged position, is actually starting to advocate for some of the other players. So that's a developing story. I'm sure you're going to be getting off and following this as it unfolds. Thank you for your time, Matt. Do you have anything further for Anthony?
No, I'm good. Anthony, thank you so much.
Good on you guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Anthony. That does it for this episode of Upon Further Review. And until next time, learn more, share more, think more, care more.